Welcome. Thank you all for coming. My name is Tricia Kress. I'm the chair of the Paulo Freire SIG. I'm the co-chair and co-organizer of this session with Sheila McLaren, who is the SIG program chair, and Miguel Zavala, who's the SIG secretary treasurer. On behalf of all of us, I welcome you to Radical Dreams and Transformative Praxis, celebrating 50 years of Pedagogy of the Oppressed. So this year, 2018, is the 50th anniversary of the publication of Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And this book, and in fact, all of Paulo Freire's works have been a transformative force in the lives of countless educators around the world. Pedagogy of the Oppressed is unyielding in its opposition to dehumanization and oppression. It's relentless in asking its readers to rethink dominant ideological notions of society and schooling and how they maintain conditions of socio-political, economic, physical, and psychological violence. It is indiscriminatory in its assertion that all people have the right to participate in the process of teaching and learning together, and through learning to read the word and the world, teachers and learners change themselves, each other, and the world. For Freire, the potential for social justice is always within and among each of us. His dream for a more humane world that is unforeseen, perhaps unimaginable, or seemingly impossible in our lifetime is radical, especially in the contemporary context. While 2018 marks the 50th anniversary of this landmark book, it also marks the one-year anniversary of America under the authoritarianism of 45. Racism, misogyny, xenophobia, homophobia, ableism, and other forms of social violence are unapologetically driving policymaking in this nation with a speed and vitriol that is frightening. And as Henry Giroux has said, these are dark times. They are turbulent, nauseating, and disorienting, and it's like perpetual motion sickness. Struggle against oppression, violence, and hatred is constant and exhausting, and it's easy to feel hopeless. But in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Freire writes, hope is rooted in men's incompletion, from which they move out in constant search, a search which can be carried out only in communion with others. Hopelessness is a form of silence, of denying the world and fleeing from it. The dehumanization resulting from an unjust order is not cause for despair, but for hope, leading to the incessant pursuit of the humanity denied by injustice. In this moment, Freire's words are encouraging, reminding his readers to resist together with a spirit of love and hope for a better future. We designed this session as a two-part immersive experience that would bring people together as a community. Our vision was to engage participants in the history, legacy, and transformative power of Freire's philosophy. In the first part of the session, we're going to hear from our amazing panel about critical pedagogy and the life of legacy of Paulo Freire. And part two will be breakout dialogue groups that feature scholars who are applying Freirean philosophy in diverse teaching and learning contexts. At the conclusion of the formal program, we are also going to be having a reception, and then following that, our business meeting for the Paulo Freire SIG, and you are welcome to join us for all of these activities. And so with that, I thank you and I welcome you to the celebration, and I turn this over to my colleague, Sheila McLaren.
Thanks, Tricia and Miguel. Can you guys hear me? It's okay? All right, barely? Can we get a little louder? Thanks. Okay, so thank you all for coming here today as we celebrate the 50th anniversary of Paulo Freire's seminal book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, with an esteemed panel of first-generation critical pedagogues. This panel brings together the most prominent and important figures in the furtherance of Paulo Freire's pedagogy and the evolution of critical pedagogy. Paulo Freire is recognized as one of the greatest thinkers in this and last century in both education and the politics of liberation. While he is known mostly for his literacy work and campaigns in Latin America and Africa, his thinking continues to be rediscovered and evolved by generations of teachers, scholars, community activists, and cultural workers globally. According to Stanley Aronowitz, the noted critical pedagogue, scholar, and friend of Paulo, Freire's name is near iconic, declaring Freire as the Latin John Dewey, and noting the brilliant methodology of this highly charged political character. El Maestro, as he was affectionately called in those days, shared ways to comprehend our present crisis and to challenge those in education to take a stand at the center of human rights and social justice. Today, the legacy of Freire's school of thought provides us with a comprehensive analysis of the issues related to struggles against the forces of neoliberalism and privatization, not just in education, but in all social life through radical democratization. Freire's work shows us how assaults on democracy can be fought and beaten. His work highlights how groups have successfully opposed such twisted forces and outlines the elements needed to build powerful mass movements to confront the institutionalization of fascist ideas, to protect marginalized communities, and to ultimately stop the current fascist threats to our democracy. Framed this way, the Pedagogy of the Oppressed provides a powerful analysis for decolonizing the mind and empowering oppressed communities. Educators, laborers, and political activists in struggles against oppression. Freire asks us this question: why and how power and oppression asks us to question why and how power and oppression play out in our daily lives. His pedagogical work is as much a call to action today as it was when it was written. In the spirit of Paulo, we need to stay ever vigilant to the ever looming political threats to democracy. In other words, we need to be awake to the assault on democratic values in this era of Trump. In response, Freire developed alternative pedagogies to counter these trends while cultivating critical engagement and collective action. This divergent group of scholars who worked with Paulo are widely recognized for their contributions to critical theory and critical pedagogy. It is these scholars here who will share and bear witness to the legacy and continued relevance of Paulo Freire's call to action as they carry on his work in their different scholarly projects, calling for ethical and intersectional resistance. It therefore gives me great pride to introduce our panelists. So, first, Nita Freire, this is widow of Paulo Freire, joins us to honor and celebrate the 50th anniversary of Pedagogy of the Oppressed. According to Donaldo Macedo, Nita Freire not only re-inspired Paulo, but re-unleashed his indignation and rebelliousness in a more direct and accessible manner. But she also influenced him to embrace a language that is more inviting, less dense, and more poetic. In essence, Macedo writes, the last 10 years of Paulo's life with Nita Freire was by far the best window through which we can see what it meant to be in the world and with others in the world. In her work, Nita Freire provides readers with the opportunity to fully understand Paulo's insistence on viewing history as a constant possibility. Nita has co-authored The Pedagogy of Hope, The Pedagogy of the Heart with Paulo, and also co-authored The Freire Reader and Chronicles of Love, My Life with Paulo Freire with Donaldo Macedo, among other works. She is currently working on translating and publishing archival manuscripts of Paulo. A few years ago, interestingly, Nita met with Pope Francis to discuss Paulo's work on literacy and human dignity. The Pope in turn told Nita he was familiar with Paulo's work and spoke of its importance for education, the poor, oppressed minorities, and women. We're therefore privileged to have Nita with us today. The next panelist is Donaldo Macedo. Donaldo Macedo is a professor of English and distinguished professor of liberal arts and education at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. He's a critical theorist, a linguist, and expert on literacy and educational studies. Macedo is the founder and former chair of the Applied Linguistics Master's Program at UMass Boston. His work with Paulo Freire broke new theoretical ground as it worked to develop critical understandings of ways in which language, power, and culture contribute to the positioning and formation of human experience and learning. Macedo was Freire's chief translator and English language interpreter. His published dialogues with Paulo Freire are considered classic works, not only for their elucidation of Freire's theories of literacy, but also for adding a more critical and theoretically advanced dimension to the study of literacy and critical pedagogy. Macedo and Freire's co-authored book, Literacy, Reading the World and the Word, is central to critical literacy in that it redefines the very nature and terrain of literacy and critical pedagogy. The next panelist, Henry Giroux, a scholar and cultural critic, currently holds McMaster University Chair of Scholarship in Public Interest in English and Cultural Studies, and Paulo Freire Distinguished Scholar in Critical Pedagogy. Henry Giroux played a prominent role in the development of critical pedagogy. Henry Giroux first met Paulo in the early 1980s and quickly shared his notions of what it meant to be a working class intellectual and the risk one had to take to make a difference. Henry writes that a lasting friendship was forged and that would last until Paulo's death. Henry's most recent books are America's Addiction to Terrorism, America at War with Itself, and the latest one, which I'm looking forward to reading, American Nightmare, Facing the Challenge of Fascism. Giroux is also a member of the Truth Out's Board of Directors. His primary research areas are cultural studies, youth studies, critical pedagogy, popular culture, media studies, social theory, and the politics of higher and public education. He's particularly interested in what he calls the war on youth and corporatization of higher education, the politics of neoliberalism, the assault on civic literacy, and the collapse of public memory, public pedagogy, and the adductive nature of politics, and the rise of various youth movements across the globe. The next panelist is Peter McLaren, distinguished professor in critical studies and co-director and international ambassador for global ethics and social justice. The Paulo Freire Democratic Project at Chapman University. He has written and edited numerous texts on Paulo Freire. His classic work, Life in School, was based on a diary McLaren kept as a school teacher in Canada in inner city, and that served residents of Canada's largest public housing. In his initial diary, Cries from the Corridor, it was published in 1980, and now is in its fourth edition. McLaren famously criticized his earlier positions taken in the Cries and went on to become a leader in critical pedagogy. Peter McLaren has long been recognized for his cutting-edge scholarship, his political activism, and as one of North America's latest exponents of the work of Paulo Freire. Ira Shor, published with Paulo Freire, the first talking book Freire did with a collaborator in 1986 called A Pedagogy for Liberation, now in its 12th printing. He also published the first book-length text on critical pedagogy in North American classrooms in 1980, Critical Teaching in Everyday Life. Shor's updated text on critical teaching, empowering education, is used in teacher programs across the country, across the world. He has a dual appointment at CUNY, CUNY's PhD program in English and Urban Education, while he's teaching undergraduate writing courses at CUNY. Last but not least, Antonia Darder is an internationally renowned scholar, artist, poet, activist, and public intellectual. She holds the Levy Presidential Endowed Chair in Ethics and Moral Leadership in the School of Education at Loyola Marymount University, and is also a professor emerita of Educational Policy and Organization and Leadership at University of Illinois. For more than 30 years, Dr. Darder's practice and scholarship have focused on political questions, ethical concerns linked to racism, class inequities, language rights, critical pedagogy, Latino education, and social justice. More recently, her work has sought to articulate a critical theory of leadership for social justice and community engagement, as well as to theorize a pedagogy of beauty in the pursuit of liberatory practice of education. How the panel is going to work is I'm going to ask each one of the panelists a question, and then the first thing is that Nita Freire is going to explicate the writing of Pedagogy of the Oppressed. So we have a PowerPoint. Nita, you ready? You're going to be ready? I just want somebody else to talk beside me. It's hot up here.
Good afternoon. For us in the room,
Yeah, I'll do it while she's
to make a tribute to my husband, Paulo Freire. I
The
am
English
so happy
translations are up here.
because
Go ahead.
it's and but I don't have
You have to turn that up.
competence to speak in English because I will read my speech in Portuguese. And
She's turning it up. She's turning it up.
no, yeah, it's an introduction. It's not in my discourse.
Okay.
When I wrote my speech, Lula, presidente do Brasil, was free. Nowadays, since 1 week, today, Lula is in prison. I want to prestar, como diz? Prestar tributo, to get one tributo to Lula and divide with all people who think about the world is possible to construir for justice, social justice, and democracy only with persons like Lula, like Paulo Freire.
Go ahead, we're ready.
Ok. Não sei se ela vai trocar tudo agora, certo? Senão faz uma confusão. E lá em Chácara foi muito confuso. Quero iniciar minha fala pedindo licença para fazer um tributo muito especial à vereadora pelo Rio de Janeiro, Marielle Franco, e seu motorista, Anderson Gomes, assassinados violentamente, para que a voz dela não se fizesse mais ouvir. Nascida e criada em favela muito violenta, cursou faculdade e pós-graduação. Seus algozes soterraram sua exemplar conduta ética e política em favor dos oprimidos e oprimidas da cidade. Inteligente, intelectualmente competente e corajosa, era um dos quadros da esquerda mais promissores para garantir a democracia no Brasil. Faço uma saudação muito calorosa aos meus companheiros de mesa, fiéis a Paulo Freire e a mim, a quem muitos lhe quero e devo. Donaldo Macedo, Henri Giroux, Peter McLaren, AERA Shor e Antonia Darder. Entendi que seria de bom alvitre narrar o processo de produção da pedagogia do oprimido, rememorando os seus 50 anos. Trata-se do livro mais conhecido e divulgado de Paulo Freire nos Estados Unidos. Não é no Brasil. It's not in Brazil. In Brazil is the other. A tradução é.
In Brazil, the best-selling Paulo's book is Pedagogy of Freedom,
Yes.
title
Millions.
Pedagogia da Autonomia.
Pedagogia da Autonomia. Transcrevo palavras que eu mesma escrevi no livro biográfico sobre a vida e obra de Paulo. Este é considerado a obra-prima de Paulo. Foi traduzido, muito possivelmente, para mais de 30 idiomas. Paulo escreveu os 3 primeiros capítulos desse livro no ano de 1967, no Chile, em apenas 15 dias, quando estava de férias, porque os estava pensando e anotando em fichas de ideias, escrevendo na cabeça, discutindo com outros intelectuais por mais de um ano. Paulo tinha o livro totalmente escrito na sua memória.
Paulo Freire had the book totally written in his memory, in his mind.
Yes. No dia que ele sentou, ele grafou o que ele tinha na cabeça.
One day he sat down and he just wrote what he had, and then Pedagogy of the Oppressed came.
Yes. It is true. It is true. It is true. Tinha desenhado em sua cabeça tudo o que considerava que iria ser a pedagogia do oprimido. Ficou meses escrevendo o 4º e último capítulo do livro, porque o fez nos momentos em que ia estudando, pensando e ordenando as suas ideias no campo da teoria política. Este havia sido um conselho de Hernani Maria Fiore, um brasileiro, filósofo brasileiro, após ler para escrever o belíssimo prefácio, importante prefácio para a língua portuguesa, em dezembro de 1967. Assim, escrevendo esta 4ª parte, nas noites e madrugadas, ao mesmo tempo em que trabalhava, só o completou em fins de 1968. Deixa eu beber um pouco da Sorry.
It's hot in here.
I don't offer because it is cachaça from Brazil. Donaldo said, no me. Oh, my God. Sim, está aqui, está aqui. Não, ainda é. Pedagogia do Oprimido teve sua primeira publicação em língua inglesa nos Estados Unidos em 1970, porque o Brasil estava em plena ditadura militar, na sua mais cruel fase. A tradutora foi Mayra Ramos, uma norte-americana que, tendo ido trabalhar no Brasil, casou-se com um pastor presbiteriano católico e aprendeu a língua portuguesa, ganhando ainda um sobrenome brasileiro, Ramos. Ela fora indicada para esse trabalho pelo teólogo Richard Shor, que não cansava de dizer: esse livro vai abalar o mundo, Paulo. A pedido de Paulo, foi ele quem escreveu o prefácio para as edições em língua inglesa. Paulo contou-me que Mayra sempre o contatava por telefone quando ele residia em Cambridge, Massachusetts, dando aulas na Universidade de Harvard para esclarecer as dúvidas de como traduzir algumas expressões novas para ela e diante da riqueza e complexidade da linguagem de Paulo. Agora é aqui, né? Cópias originais desse livro, em português, foram traduzidos para o Brasil foram trazidos para o Brasil da Suíça pelo amigo e professor Jean Ziegler. Por sua identificação com os oprimidos, ofereceu-se para essa difícil missão, porque, com o seu passaporte de diplomata, ele era deputado pelo Cantão de Genebra, ele não teria sua bagagem revistada ao desembarcar no Brasil. Assim, por ousadia de Fernando Gasparian, que enfrentou o regime militar, a editora Paz e Terra publicou A Pedagogia do Oprimido, da sua primeira edição brasileira, em 1974, quando já tinha sido traduzido dos originais em português para, obviamente, o inglês, o espanhol, o francês, o italiano, o alemão, o grego, o holandês e o português de Portugal, que é um pouco diferente do nosso. Não estás a pôr, não? É.
She's saying that Brazilian Portuguese is a dialect.
É o quê? O que você disse? É baladiço.
O vosso português é dialeto.
O nosso não. No, it's not true. The main Portuguese is from Brazil.
Okay.
Bem, transcrevo aqui, que eu digo, uma resenha desse livro feita pelo próprio Paulo, em carta escrita em 3 de setembro de 1968, endereçada à irmã Cristina, uma freira que tinha contatos com Paulo desde o Brasil, e ela continuava no Brasil. Publicada, eu publiquei na Pedagogia da Tolerância. Abre aspas, Paulo escreveu: o livro tem 4 capítulos. No primeiro, analiso a consciência oprimida e a opressora subconstituindo-se na realidade objetiva. Estudo-as em sua dialeticidade e coloco a questão da superação da contradição entre elas, de que nasce o novo homem. Novo, não mais opressor, não mais oprimido. Homem libertando-se. Homens e mulheres, né? Porque Paulo, nessa época, escrevia homens quando já... não era comum se escrever homens e mulheres, mas quando ele diz homens, eram homens e mulheres. No segundo, apresento e critico os fundamentos do que venho chamando de concepção bancária da educação, que, transformando a consciência dos homens numa espécie de panela, vai enchendo-a com depósitos que são falso saber. Esta é a educação que, castrando a essência de ser da consciência, sua intencionalidade, serve à opressão. Em segundo, descrevo o que me parece ser a educação como prática da liberdade, que se instaura como uma situação guiseneológica, em que o educador educando, em diálogo com o educando-educador, se fazem sujeitos complacentes mediados pelo objeto cognoscível. No terceiro, trato da dialogicidade da educação, que tem como ponto de partida a busca do conteúdo programático da educação, que não pode ser realizado apenas pelo polo do educador, dentro de uma concepção libertária da educação. Essa busca implica no conhecimento de pensar do povo referido ao mundo, em cuja relação dialética vamos encontrar o que chamo de temas geradores. Assim, a educação libertária, na alfabetização, investiga a palavra geradora do povo e, na pós-alfabetização, o tema gerador. Exposto toda a metodologia desta investigação que venho teorizando nestes anos de exílio. No quarto capítulo, o maior em número de páginas, analiso, resultado também do exílio, o que, em última análise, é o livro todo, as teorias da ação que nasceram das matrizes dialógica e antidialógica. O livro mesmo, com as suas marcas, às vezes até ostensivas, cristãs, com um pouco do teológico, é um livro forte e duro. Terminam aqui as palavras de Paulo. Vocês todos e todas concordarão comigo que, pela longevidade desta obra, ela é uma obra-prima, uma obra clássica, uma obra que os educadores e educadoras, todos e todos que querem explicar as condições e as relações de opressão, precisam estudá-la. É o que vem ocorrendo nos países da língua inglesa. Aliás, esse próprio evento que nos reúne é o melhor exemplo. A pedagogia do oprimido vive. Quero concluir este texto sobre a influência, a repercussão e a atualização da obra de Paulo Freire, informando o fato da mais alta importância que comprovam minha afirmação. 2 pesquisas internacionais realizadas em 2016 comprovam que o pensamento do patrono da educação brasileira continua quase anos depois da publicação socialização de sua obra, Pedagogia do Oprimido, como modelo e fonte para endossar e referendar estudos e trabalhos na área das ciências humanas. A Open Syllabus pesquisou em mais de 1 milhão de programas de estudos de universidades em países de língua inglesa, Estados Unidos, Reino Unido, Austrália e Nova Zelândia, e constatou que a Pedagogia do Oprimido é o 99º livro mais citado e que Paulo é o único brasileiro entre os 100, o número 100, mais citado e mais mais solicitados para a leitura dos estudantes nas universidades dos Estados Unidos. E também que a Pedagogia do Oprimido é o 2º livro melhor colocado no campo da educação, perdendo apenas para Teaching for Quality Learning in University, What the Student Does, de John Biggs. O projeto reúne mais de 1 milhão de emendas de estudos universitários americanos, ingleses, austríacos e neozelandeses, de disciplinas de instrução de ensino superior em todos esses países e verifica, repito, quais são os livros mais solicitados pelos professores para estudos e pesquisas de estudantes. A Open Syllabus informa ainda que o livro Pedagogia do Oprimido é requerido 1.021 emendas de universidades e faculdades dos Estados Unidos. Não é pouca coisa. Fica à frente de clássicos como Rei Lear, de Shakespeare, Moby Dick, de Herman Melville e O Banquete, de Platão. Outra pesquisa, realizada pelo professor associado Elliot Green, da London School of Economics, analisou as obras mais citadas na língua inglesa, trabalhos disponíveis na Google Scholar, ferramenta de pesquisas dedicada à literatura acadêmica, criada em 2004 e que é, desde então, uma referência crescente para pesquisadoras, e constatou que a Pedagogia do Oprimido é o 3º livro mais citado mundialmente na área de ciências sociais. Segundo ele, Paulo Freire é citado 72.359 vezes, atrás apenas do filósofo americano Thomas Kuhn, com 81.311, e do sociólogo também norte-americano Everett Rogers, com 72.780 citações. Ele é mais referido do que os pensadores como Michel Foucault, que tinha 60.700, e Karl Marx, com 40.237. Enfim, em 2018, 2 pesquisas demonstram o impacto da obra de Paulo a nível mundial, o consagrando como um dos maiores e mais importantes pensadores do mundo atual. Não há como duvidar que a pedagogia do oprimido é referência constante em estudos na área de ciências humanas, desde que foi lançado em língua inglesa nos Estados Unidos em 1970 e no Brasil em 1974. Livro base, fundamental para a compreensão de seu pensamento progressista, que contém os princípios básicos de toda a sua obra teórica e de sua teoria ético, político, antropológico, libertadora. Eu escrevi mais 3 páginas, I wrote 3 pages more, but don't was translated to English.
It's my fault.
Yes, I ask, but I don't have the intention to read because it's too much cansativo.
It's tiresome to continue to read.
Yes, to read for yours to listen me. Then it is print in Portuguese. Who wanted to
We
read
made
the
copies.
translation? It's I guarantee. It's a very fundamental and important approach I did theoretically about the Paulo's work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nita. We have copies of English, Portuguese translations somewhere, and Miguel is going to put both English and Portuguese translations in the Freire SIG newsletter. So sign up for your memberships. No, we'll give it to anybody who wants it. So we're ready to move on. So the next panelist is going to be Donaldo Macedo, and we're asking Donaldo, as a first-generation critical pedagogue, please share with the group how you met Paulo and the impact he's had on your personal life and your scholarly trajectory.
Sheila talks about being the first generation, but what she didn't tell you that when I started working with Henry Giroux, I don't feel that old. When I started working with Henry Giroux and Paulo Freire, I was in grammar school. And, but first, before I begin, I really want us to give a round of applause to Sheila, to Chris, and to Miguel for putting this together, and Paulo deserves that. I also want to take just 1 second to recognize and to thank Nita Freire for traveling all those hours from Brazil to come and share her ideas with us. I want to mention that for a number of years, almost a decade, Paulo wrote very little. It's not until he fell in love with Nita Freire that the passion and the motivation and the excitement to want to share his idea with the world through the insistence of Nita, because I was present in many of those discussions, he was able to write many of the books that we now celebrate, like Pedagogy of Freedom. Thank you, Nita, for the long trip for coming. Okay? I was asked to talk about how I met Paulo Freire and how he impacted me. Let me begin by saying that I would not have met Paulo Freire if I had not been a personal mechanic of Henry Giroux. Right? He had a Triumph that broke down twice a week. So while I was fixing the brakes, Henry would then talk Pedagogy of the Oppressed and other work that he was doing at the time. But I cannot say that without Henry, I don't think we would have critical pedagogy, at least critical pedagogy as we know it here in the United States. It began when Henry asked me, that's how I met Paulo Freire, to translate 3 pages that Paulo had written as a preface to his book, Theories and Resistance, yeah. It's been so many years, yeah. Theories and Resistance. I was schooled in Portuguese. I had just finished my doctorate in linguistics, psycholinguistics, and I couldn't translate the 3 pages. And I began to question myself, is something wrong with the education that you got? Or is it really that Paulo's prose is so cumbersome, as some people claim, that I'm not able to translate? So Henry, impatiently patient, every day, twice a day, would ask me, is it done yet? Is it done yet? He wanted, because Bergen Gavi, which I'll mention in a little while, wanted the book out as soon as possible. Not Bergen Gavi. His publisher wanted the book out as soon as possible, but also we had the pressure of the translation of Politics of Education that Bergen Gavi really wanted us to publish as soon as possible, which I had to translate, cost me a marriage. I had to translate and go to bed at 4 o'clock almost every day.
That's the only reason. That's right.
Yeah. Sheila, can't take her anywhere. But what really cemented the excitement, the enthusiasm, and the compassion for the work that we had begun, in early 80s, 1982 to be exact, was a dinner that Henry Giroux offered when Paulo came to Boston, actually to Boston College, to teach a seminar, not in the School of Education, but in the School of Theology. In that dinner, there was Henry Giroux, myself, Stanley Aronowitz, Jim Fraser. No, not Jim Fraser. He was not there. The publisher of Bergen Gavian, Jim Bergen, and a graduate student that Henry had, the student that moved into Ohio when you got exiled. What's his name? Yeah, exactly. And that dinner, in that dinner, discussions were incredibly energetic in the room, and with Jim Bergen agreed with Henry and Paulo Freire to offer them this important series in Bergen Gavi that Paulo and Henry co-edited. It is through this series that Henry and Paulo published over 100 books of young critical scholars that before that did not have access and avenue to publication. If you had to go to peer review, the Harvard Review, etc., etc., etc. But in addition to that, what I also want to say, there were other movements. For example, Henry almost took over the Boston Journal of Education, and working with students and exposing students to Paulo Freire's work, to critical work. And Kathleen Weiler was one of her first doctoral students that was the editor. So the Boston University Journal of Education began to become the most radical journal in the country, if not in the world. Kathleen was followed by Candace Mitchell, a former colleague of mine, that in fact we totally took over, because I was a board member, advisory board member, and Henry was an advisory board member. We totally took over that, people like, my friend Peter McLaren got published, and many other got published, took over the journal, to the point that John Silber, at a certain moment, had the dean call the students in and say, enough is enough, took the journal, and we all got a letter, thank you for your time, as advisory board. In addition to that, there was a very important, very, very important conference at UMass Amherst in 1984 that put together by Peter Parks, where again we all got together, and AERA Shor was there, Henry was there, Stanley Ranowitz was there, and many others. That conference got followed by another important conference in Irvine in 1987 that Tom Wilson put together. Again, we all got together, and this is where I met Antonia Darder and many other people. And I also want to say, in conjunction to all this energy in Boston, my wife, Lilia Bartolome, got hired at Harvard, and in 1991, in 1993, she began to do what Henry done, with Boston Journal of Education. I have 2 minutes. Boston Journal of Education by publishing Henry Giroux, Paulo Freire, Peter McLaren, myself, Stanley Ranowitz, Bell Hooks, and others. Again, the full professors called the students who were the editors in, were reprimanded and told that if they don't stop publishing, I can't even say it because I'd be publicly swearing, they would take the journal away from them. So this is basically the legacy of the critical pedagogy along the side of the work that was being done. AERA Shor was doing great work in New York area along with Michelle Fine and Stanley Ranowitz and others. Let me just finish because she just told me that I had to be in time.
AERA, don't blame me.
Huh?
AERA.
Yeah, okay. In time, by saying to you that Paulo, until the end of his life, he always said, I will paraphrase him, that change is difficult, but it is possible. It is always possible to make the world less discriminatory, more just, less dehumanizing, and more humane. Yeah. And to change and to transform the world also implies always a revolutionary love infused, according to Paulo Freire, what he called a just anger, unquote. An anger with compassion, passion, and an unwavering commitment to hope. A hope imbued in our denouncement of the duplicity of many educators who accommodate, educators who willingly embrace the social construction of not seeing, so that they can justify teaching on their knees, while denouncing aggressively the domesticity of most educators who accommodate. We simultaneously need to also, as Paulo always urged us, to announce that you should be teaching standing up, a language with a new educational vision based on the permanent struggle against social injustice, discrimination, homophobia, racism. I can go on, a struggle that points to the construction of a future shaped and guided by love, humility, and humanity. And let me end by saying that I never forget Nita and Paulo's love, the way they got practice on a daily life in interaction with one another. I was very fortunate to see that. But I'll end by paraphrasing Paulo for us to never, as he's challenged us, to never fear, for us to dare to love and to speak about love without fearing that we be called ascientific, if not anti-scientific. Paulo also dared us to love without risking being called to talk about love and to love without risking being called ascientific or anti-scientific, to never dichotomize the emotional self from cognition. I would end by going with the flow of his daring us to embrace a type of love for the humanity, for us to continue to dare to love, to struggle with compassion, with passion, with humility, and love for the humankind. Because those children in front of us, they grow up to be who we are. I would not be here today if it had not for a teacher who basically, without being tongue-tied in English, because I did not speak English, I was referred to go to Franklin Institute to be a TV repairman, and then he sent me to UMass Boston, where I got accepted in 2 weeks because a friend of his worked in the admissions office, the first black African-American guidance counselor in Boston. So he touched me. I am here today because of John O'Brien. I am here today because of Henry Giroux. I'm here today because of Paulo. It is that transformation because Paulo gave me the language that I did not have, the criticity that I did not have, to figure out what it means to be, as a colonized person that I was all my life, at the periphery of the intimate yet fragile relationship between the colonized and the colonized. Obrigado, gracias.
This is tough. I could listen to these guys all night. I'm sure you can too. So Henry's going to talk about how Paulo's work enlarges our understanding of the relationship between education and politics. Henry Giroux.
First of all, I'm utterly delighted and humbled to be here, particularly in the presence of Nita and many friends who, over the years, had to endure a number of struggles because politics is never easy. And when it's easy, you know you're doing something wrong. I think there are two quick stories, because I have 10 minutes, which is not the greatest amount of time, but I have two stories that I think are interesting about, certainly with respect to Paulo. In the first, I was a high school teacher in the 1960s, and I had a vice principal who was like the madcap disciplinarian. And he saw me one day sitting in a circle with my students, and he came in and he told me that I couldn't do that anymore. And I was like shocked. I said, well, they like it. And he said, what do you mean they like it? And I couldn't answer him. I was involved in an experience that didn't take a detour through theory. And so all I could say was it worked. And that day, I got in the mail Pedagogy of the Oppressed. I went home, I stayed up all night, believe it or not, I read the book, and all of a sudden I was on fire. I was on fire because I had a language. Because Power begins with words.
Right.
It begins with the ability to understand the conditions that bear down on your life. It begins to give you the recognition that if you're not an agent, you're somebody else's agent. The second story that I love about Paulo, Paulo was such a sweet man. In an age when self-interest is of the highest ideal, in an age when the only politics that left is private, you have Paulo, the antithesis. And I was at a conference once, and this guy came up to me and he said, "What's happening with Paulo Freire?" He says, every talk he gives, he talks about love. He had just met Nita. and I said to him, "What's the story, Paulo? You're talking about, I'm in love, you. How can I stop?" All right, let me begin. I want to talk today in the shadow of a number of resistance movements that speak to us in a time of neo-fascism. All over the globe, illiberal democracy is on the march. It's on the march in Poland. It's on the march in Hungary. It's on the march in France. And these are neo-Nazis. They have a language, they have a cultural politics, they have a movement, they have a theory, and they understand the social media. In other words, they know something about education. They know that central, it seems to me, the education, central to, as Paulo understood, education was central to politics. We're not just talking about schooling. We're talking about what it means to not only change consciousness, but also, in a sense, to produce active and engaged critical citizens. So when people often say to me, "Well, Paulo was about a methodology," that is such nonsense. It wasn't about a methodology. It was about a project. It was, what do you do in the face of racism? What do you do in the face of fascism? What do you do to change people's consciousness so there is an element of identification at work in which, in the language that we can use, or that we use, they can recognize not only elements of themselves, but they can further recognize the conditions that allow them not to recognize what it would mean to vote for somebody like Donald Trump.
Right.
What it would mean not to all of a sudden wake up and recognize that in this world, you have to have a comprehensive understanding of what we're talking about. Politics is not just about single issues. It's not just about single issues. And this is not an argument against single issues. It's an argument about the thread that works through them that allows us to understand both their viability and their connections. And he got it. He got it. He never focused on politics in terms of one specific thing. He was not just an educator of literacy. He was a guy who believed that capitalism had to come to an end, that capitalism and democracy were not the same thing. He was a humanist socialist. He knew, he understood that in some way the great struggle was going to have to take place, it seems to me, on the cultural front, long before the left understood this. Sure, there was Gramsci, and sure, there was Raymond Williams, and sure, there were other people like Castoriadis who understood how important education was, but the left never really got that, because the left in general tended to believe that power was about economic structures, that the only form of domination that mattered was structural, when in fact, as Václav Havel used to say, politics follows culture. It follows culture. Unless you can change people's consciousness, unless there's a sense of identification, unless you can bring people in and speak to them in ways that suggest something about the historical conditions and the context in which they find themselves, it's over. You won't win the war. The notion of collective struggle will simply not take place. So it seems to me that, like Arendt, education for Paulo was a protective space, a place to think against the grain, where individuals could imagine themselves as critical and pedagogical social agents. Paulo was a public intellectual. He was a public intellectual because he was not just simply humble. He was a public intellectual because he could speak to people in multiple languages. He was a border crosser. He understood the relevance of context. He didn't believe in scripts, and he rarely ever read a speech. He believed in talking to an audience in some way by gaining a sense of what it was that he had to say that would move them, that would touch them, that in some way would be a response to the conditions in which they currently found themselves. But he did something else. that we need to understand in the terrible moment in which we find ourselves. He urged people to mobilize on multiple fronts. Not just on one front, on multiple fronts. To take the powers that we have and the skills that we have, and rather than shaming other people who don't emulate what we do, recognize that people will intervene in the world with the gifts that they have. I don't need Toni Morrison handing out flyers in front of factories. I'm not going to condemn her for that. She writes, she's a writer, that's what she does. She intervenes in that way. I don't think that shaming people is the pedagogical tool that we should use in the name of a revolutionary ethic. I don't think that political purity works when the only language that we have are binarisms. Because in any binarism, you're always on the side of angels. There's no dialogue, there's no opening up the space. I don't want to challenge common space, I want to break it open. I want to understand how it works in ways that I hadn't thought about before, and that was certainly, it seems to me, what Paulo did. Paulo understood that pedagogy was always a struggle, not just simply over meaning. It was a struggle over agency. It was a struggle over the narratives that we use to define ourselves in a world in which we're also defining what knowledge counts, what kind of future matters. So when I hear people, I mean, I should tell this crowd, right? When I hear people say, politics is neutral, I always say to myself, you're from Ohio. I mean, but I lived in Ohio, so don't take offense. There are people in Ohio who don't believe that. But it seems to me that in the end, rather than talk about love, I want to talk about passion. And I want to talk about compassion. And I'm trying to understand what it means to live in your body and live in your head at the same time. You know, as a working class kid, as for many of you, we're defined by our deficits, not by our strengths. And at that moment when education becomes a practice of liberation, a practice of freedom, we flip the script. We flip it. And what that means is that those values usually held by ruling class types who are completely divorced from their bodies, as you well know, you know, all of a sudden when we realize that they're the deficits, and our sense of solidarity, our sense of compassion, our sense of working with others, our sense in believing in human beings, our sense that self-interest is not the highest of all ideals, our sense that economics should not govern all of social life, that there is something else at work. The script gets flipped. And when the script is flipped, you've liberated yourself. They don't have you anymore. You don't have to be humiliated in the face of their language. You don't have to believe that somehow your strengths are always liabilities. You don't have to believe that your accent doesn't matter. You don't have to believe that the clothes you wear or the school you went to. I mean, I can't tell you how many people I've met from these schools who will come up to me after a lecture and say, well, I loved your talk, but I hated your passion. You know, and I always say to them, you know, in my neighborhood, we touched each other, put our arms around each other, we spoke to each other. I don't live in your neighborhood, and I don't want to. Right. See you later.
This is such a treat, such a treat. Our next panelist is Peter McLaren, and Peter is going to talk about spirituality and the role that it played in Paulo's work. Peter McLaren.
Wow. I'm afraid this is going to fall. Okay. Just got to do my pants up. I think they're going to slide. Thanks. Yeah, I don't want to give people nightmares. Yeah. All right, there we go. Well, thanks to the generosity of spirit of Henry Giroux and Donaldo Macedo, who arranged for me to meet Paulo Freire in person in 1985. It was my privilege to have witnessed Paulo walking among us, laughing, light-footed, his tiny shoulders heaving like twin turbines beneath his crisp, freshly starched shirt, his slender legs gliding with a carefree, insouciant lilt, as if he were being helped along by some puckish breeze that served as a counterpoint to his steady, almost, to me at least, relentless gaze. To me, it seemed as though we were always peering into the present somewhere from the future, in some future anterior where dreams are on a collision course with what is occurring in the laboratories of everyday life that we call reality, where light breaks through, sometimes breaks through, the dark chambers that cannot be illuminated without love. Now, to understand that collision is to understand the grand mysterium of Paulo Freire's work. Freire was a Christian and a humanist socialist, and while I never had a chance to discuss with Paulo the topic of liberation theology, I believe that it would have been a fascinating dialogue, perhaps even more fascinating than the dialogue I had recently with Obispo Colombo in La Rioja, Argentina, when I went to visit him to ask him about Pope Francis, Papa Francisco's view of liberation theology, and I wanted to talk a little bit about Paulo's work in liberation theology. I knew that Nita Freire had a meeting with Pope Francis at the Vatican, and I was very interested in what Obispo Colombo had to say about his childhood friend, Pope Francis. And he told me, Peter, Pope Francis is not about theology of liberation, but he prefers to call it the theology of the people. There's some elements of liberation theology, and there's other additional elements that wouldn't traditionally fall under the work of liberation theology. So it would have been fascinating had I had that conversation with Paulo about liberation theology. But today there seems to be almost a kind of congenital reluctance to speak of spirituality in terms other than those generated by evangelicals, whether they're from the mouths of Christian or atheist fundamentalists in a world dominated by a rudderless market culture of high-gloss consumption championed by the caviar authoritarian populists that frequent the Sea Lake Palace known as Mar-a-Lago. It's impossible to consider liberation theology, it's important, rather, to consider liberation theology as a nexus where people of all faiths can come to recognize not only their preferential option for the poor, but I would argue their preferential obligation to the poor, to the immiserated, to whom Franz Fanon used the term, the wretched of the earth. So I'm more familiar with the Catholic tradition, and I write now in the Catholic tradition of liberation theology, but liberation theology brings together all faiths. It's not just Catholic, it's not just Christian. But Paulo was a Christian and a socialist humanist. Freire has addressed the role of theologians in the church in his work. Its formalism, supposed neutrality, and its captivity in a complex web of bureaucratic rights that pretends to serve the oppressed, but actually supports the power elite. From the perspective of the philosophy of praxis that Paulo developed throughout his life. For Freire, critical consciousness cannot be divorced from his own Christian consciousness. In Freire's attack on bourgeois subjective idealism as naive consciousness approaches a transformation of consciousness as a political act. Because, in the words of Paulo Freire, to speak a true word is to transform the world. To speak a true word is to transform the world. The ruling class, from Freire's perspective, views consciousness as something that can be transformed by lessons, lectures, and eloquent sermons. In this instance, consciousness is essentially static, what Paulo called necrophilic, death-loving, as distinct from biophilic, life-loving. And this necrophilic consciousness constitutes an uncritical adherence to the ruling class and serves as a meaning of emptying conscientization of its dialectical content. But I want to quote now from a wonderful book that was edited by James Giroux. I would like to quote directly from Nita Freire and her interview with James Giroux. And Nita spoke this. Paulo was a man of authentic faith, believed in God. And while he was Catholic, he was not caught up in the religiosity of the faith. He believed in Jesus Christ and in his kindness, wisdom, and goodness. He did, however, have grave concerns with the church, particularly the contradictions of its actions and the actions of the priests. And I'm still quoting from Nita. For example, he observed since his childhood how many priests ate well and gained weight, yet the poor remained poor and hungry, only to hear the priests say to them, "Don't worry, God is with you, and your reward is great in heaven." For Paulo, many priests, with their belly full, did not have authentic compassion and empathy for the poor, and were not consistent with what they had said and with what they did. And Nita Freire goes on to say, when Gustavo Gutierrez invited Paulo to work on some components related to liberation theology, Paulo began to analyze the distinct differences among what he called the traditional church, the modern church, and the prophetic church. The prophetic church is one that gives witness and is a liberated church, one that feels with you, one that is in solidarity with you, with all the oppressed in the world, the exploited ones, and the ones that are victimized by a capitalist society. End of quotation. Now, given Nita's insights, the most important aspect of Freire's work, at least as it pertains to the context of revolutionary critical pedagogy, captures much of the spirit of the work of Jesuit scholar José Porfirio Miranda, the work of John Sobrino, Leonardo Boff, Gustavo Gutierrez, James Cone, and many others. And it certainly captures the spirit of Reverend Martin Luther King, Dolores Huerta, Grace Lee Boggs, Raya Dunayevskaya, Angela Davis, Rosa Luxemburg, and Dorothy Day. While Paulo enjoys the kind of, following that attends some celebrities, he shunned fame. He was a materialist and a Catholic, but he did not have an ideological belief in materialism. And this helped to open the door to a form of utopianism. And while Paulo enjoys this celebrity, again, he shunned this fame, and he looked at the future as one that refused to ignore the difficulties of living in everyday life in the capitalist present. Paulo's utopianism did not pull a veil over the challenges offered by the present. His was a concrete utopianism rather than an abstract utopianism, grounded in the struggle of everyday life, in a manner that revealed that if we can get glimpses of the future by examining the contradictions of the present, then we truly have found ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Next speaker is Ira Shor. And Ira is going to speak about how critical literacy landed Paulo in jail.
Well, I am so glad that Peter mentioned the word biophilic, which Paulo means life-loving. And what I want to do in the first part of my talk is discuss Paulo's passion for food. because until you go to dinner with Paulo, you really haven't eaten, and so on. But what's that? You can't hear me? Can you hear me now? Okay. I'm going to start all over again because you paid full admission and you deserve it. Okay. So I'm delighted that my old friend Peter McLaren has mentioned biophilic and Paulo's concern about food, because this is a passion that you can't do without when dealing with Paulo. And until you go to dinner with Paulo, you don't really know what it means to eat. But before I tell you that wonderful story, and I am hungry, I missed lunch, so I'm looking forward to someone taking me to dinner as soon as possible. First, when Paulo came to conferences, he traveled a great deal. First of all, he was forced out of Brazil for many years and traveled the world reluctantly. He called himself a vagabond of the obvious and a peregrine of the revolution. And this was a reluctant identity he embraced, because it's hard to imagine a more Brazilian individual than Paulo. And if you visited Paulo in Brazil, you would see he was like a fish swimming in water. He loved Brazilian food. He loved the music. He loved the romance. And it seemed to me that what you could say about Brazilians is that Brazilians are the happiest, saddest people in the world. And so on. And I happened to visit him during my birthday in 1987. When he heard it was my birthday, he and his students made a birthday party for me that lasted 3 nights. And first of all, I'm Jewish. I'm the only Jew on the table. And all these Christians are having their say, because Paulo was a Christian Catholic, so it's very important that Jews get representation. And one thing is that Jews don't drink. That I grew up among working class Jews where the liquor cabinet was always open and nobody ever bothered looking at it, because that was considered to be a virtue of our tribe and so on. So to be toasted 3 nights in a row in Brazil, I had to be carried to the airport at the end and so on, and it was the best birthday of my life. But look, what I want to first tell you is that Paulo would come to conferences and he would say, look, don't treat me like an icon. I want to be treated like a human being. So don't worship me, okay? That's the first thing. The second thing he says, don't expect me to tell you what the answers are or how to win or something like that. What he wanted most of all was that his presence should be a pretext for all the folks who had gathered to find each other and to discover in dialogue together how to fight better for social justice. That's what he wanted. He didn't want to be telling people how to do that. He wanted, because he's there, I'm the pretext that you gather around to find your next task. So in the honor of that tradition, Paulo said, I want to introduce you, just mention this book that just came out hot off the press from what I think is the most wonderful education activist group we have in America now, Rethinking Schools Group. Yes, I love them. They began in 1986 on the kitchen table of 5th grade teacher Bob Peterson, and they have taught us in the last 32 years what is possible even in the worst of times. And this is their latest publication. It's called Teaching for Black Lives, and I'm sure you understand what the reference is, and it's being sold at the conference, and I can't wait to read it, and I hope you folks buy it too. Okay, now look, I opened my mailbox in 1982. I was living in the West Village of Manhattan, and out popped an aerogram. I looked at the aerogram, and I saw exotic postage, and I collected postage stamps as a boy, and I thought, this is really nice. And I looked closer and closer, and it said Brazil. Then I looked at the address, and it was handwritten Paulo Freire. At that point, I collapsed on the floor, and the neighbors carried me up to my apartment, and when I woke up, I realized I had to open the letter and read it. Anyhow, he wrote me a letter. It seems very peculiar, but that one of Paulo's children, Lut, went to Michigan, and that Paulo would occasionally go there and visit, whatever. And when he passed through Michigan at one time, and someone gave him a copy of this book that I had written called Critical Teaching in Everyday Life that was benefited greatly from his ideas, and he wrote me a letter about the book. which was astonishing to me. And he in his words, he said, "Thank you for all the beautiful words," and so on. I wrote him a letter saying thank you, so on and so on. But about 6 months later, the phone rang, and Paulo called me from Stanford, where he was in residence for an adult education seminar. And he wanted me to fly in 1983 to Stanford to join him in this thing. I was writing a new book, and I couldn't get away, so he said, "Come to Amherst." In February of '84. So I came to Amherst, and I came to Amherst, and Paulo was said, "Meet me at a pizza parlor." And I went to the pizza parlor, and I parked the car. And when I looked through the window, I was very anxious about meeting him. And when I came in through the restaurant door, he stood up, and it turned he's a short man, and he's very robust, but short, with a very homey beard and so on. And he got up and he embraced me and so on. And I was sure that I was going to collapse on him, and he would have to carry me to the table. But anyhow, we talked for a few days, and then I got the idea that I was on the road continually, and I started teaching 50 years ago. And it's hard to imagine, but that's true, 50 years ago. And I started going on the road in the middle 70s, and I was traveling around a lot talking to teachers. Teachers kept asking a similar range of questions about this pedagogy that Paulo Freire was doing. So I collected the questions, and I said, why don't we, do a book about the questions that teachers ask most often about what is this pedagogy, how do you do it? So he said, yes, let's start tonight. So that's Paulo Freire. Now, what happened was when I arrived, the African-American students on campus at Amherst just wanted to feast Paulo by themselves. So we walked over one afternoon and went into the dormitory, and they set out this great feast of African foods and so on. Now, my habit is that when I was constantly on the road, and when you're on the road, you never know when you're going to get a good meal, because you have to fly and the airplane, so on, your airports and this stuff. So my habit is that whenever I saw good food, I would eat 2 meals at once, because I figured it has to last a while. So I was the slowest one going down the buffet, and I had 2 plates, and I was filling up both plates because there was my habit and so on. Paulo Freire was behind me, and he's looking at me, and he says, "You have 2 lunches." So I said, "Yes." I said, "I eat a lot. I'm very hungry," and so on and so on. So this is what introduced me to Paulo's passion for food. That he, like Peter said, he had this notion of life-loving and biophilic, and then he starts saying, "I do not trust," he says to me at the table as we're sitting in the African American, he says, "I do not trust anyone who does not like food," he says. And then, I thought, this is great, a philosopher who can start delivering a lecture on food at the table. And he says, to love food is to love life. It's biophilic, and so on. All right, so now you know that all of us at this table, whether we're Jewish or Christian, all of us at this table, we have eaten well in our time with Paulo. Okay, look, I just want to briefly review in the few minutes that are remaining where all this got started, and that all of us have been the generous beneficiaries of Paulo's attention, and we've done what we can to justify his attention in being hard at work over the last 30 or 40 years to bring this knowledge out and what have you. And the folks sitting at the table have probably produced over 50 books over this time. And that's a library. And so we've been trying to earn the right to be part of Paulo's legacy. Paulo, on March 31st, 1964, Paulo was at that time the director of the National Literacy Program, and he was in the small town of Goiânia, which is about 100 miles southwest of Brasília, the capital, where he had moved with his family to take an office in the administration of President João Goulart. And while he was doing what we call in education a PD session, professional development, to help launch, and it was his job to launch 20,000 literacy circles immediately in Brazil, and with the intention that the Goulart government, which was a liberal nationalist government, was going to hope to qualify 5 million illiterate peasants and workers to vote. Now, Brazil had slavery until 1888. And in 1888, slavery was abolished. In 1889, the first constitution was promulgated. First Constitution said that the only people allowed to vote are men who can read and write. In 1932, the second Constitution was announced, and the second Constitution allowed women to vote also who could read and write, but illiterates were not allowed to vote. When Paulo Freire set to work in the 50s and 60s, 20 million out of Brazil's 70 million people were illiterate and disqualified from voting. This guaranteed that the oligarchy would always win the elections and did not have to rule by violence because they just simply eliminated the right of the ordinary people to vote. So that's where literacy, that's what we say, where does the rubber hit the road? Literacy was such an important political project at that time because it would now enfranchise 20 million Brazilians to vote from the bottom up for the left-wing parties who had brought them to vote and promised them a future different than the horrendous past. That was Paulo's job, and he had worked on this for 15 years prior to practice this method. Method was cheap, and it taught basic literacy in 40 hours, 2 sessions a week for so on, 2 hours each. And then the first graduating class was at Angigos in the northeast part of Brazil, and the President of the Republic, João Goulart, came there in April 2nd, 1963, and he brought his entire cabinet with him to witness the first graduating class of Paulo Freire's literacy program. They came there, and the students stood up, and they said, I'm no longer part of the masses. I am now part of the people because I have the right to vote, and I can change my own future, and so on. And they made those speeches, which were very impressive. President Goulart said, wonderful, wonderful, and they all applauded. The only problem is that part of the delegation of the cabinet that came with them was General Castelo Branco. General Castelo Branco at that time was the Chief of Defense, the Secretary of Defense, and almost 1 year to the day, he led the coup. That man, I gotta go. Okay, that's it. He led the coup. He led the coup that crushed Paulo. Paulo came back from Goiânia, and he was told that the coup was underway, and people were being arrested and thrown in jail, and so on and so on. And Paulo went into hiding until April 7th, when apparently he heard there was no warrant for his arrest. So then he took his family back to Recife, where they settled in. And at the end of June, April 14th, his literacy program was crushed, and then he was jailed, and eventually he feared a longer arrest and so on, so he decided to leave the country. So that's changed Paulo's life, and it brought forward out of that experience a different understanding on his part of what power relations can do, and where education fits, and what it meant to teach against that moment. So thank you very much.
Thank you, AERA. I just want you all to know that Bloomsbury is setting up a book exhibit, and there'll be a wine reception afterwards, and Miguel is going to tell you more about the breakout sessions. But however, Antonia Darder has been patiently waiting, and we want to hear from her. Antonia is going to talk about how her work captured and reinvented Paulo's pedagogy of love.
All right, there's like a million things that I can say, and there's only a few minutes to say them. And first of all, I want to say ditto to my brothers on the panel and to Nita in terms of the many issues that they've already raised, and I don't need to go over there. I want to say, Henry, in this arena, I want to say thank you to you, because in so many ways, Henry was very instrumental in relationship to my intellectual formation and to the deepening of my understanding of Paulo Freire's work. And I think that one of the things that were important to me in relationship to Paulo is that he understood the issue of coherence, and he understood the issue of loyalty. And he understood that it had to do with our struggle for liberation had to be tied to our capacity to have faith in others, to trust others, and to learn forgiveness in relationship to the work. That it also required us to have a clear foundation intellectually, as well as an embodied foundation, to understand that resistance is something we do with our bodies. And if anyone shows us that, our young people out in the streets. They do it with their bodies. And Paulo would come back to this question of body. So the body for me has been a central issue, but it also has been a very feminist issue. And so what often people don't think about Paulo's work is that Paulo had this incredible capacity to bring masculinity and femininity together. And it's often missed because our epistemologies are such that we continuously fall into the binaries that make it difficult for us to truly embrace difference, to truly understand that we can struggle across our differences, that we don't have to be unified in our political struggle and our political project. We do not have to be uniform human beings. That on the contrary, what allows us in terms of the passion that Henry spoke, the compassion that we're able to build, it comes from our capacity to be in our bodies, to be truly who we are, to find a certain sense of our sensibility that comes from our history, our lived history. It comes from the reality. I am a colonized subject. And sometimes when you say this within an academic context, they look at you like you have four heads. But if we look at what happened in Puerto Rico, in terms of that, my family in Puerto Rico still is struggling with issues of water, still is struggling around issues of food. I mean, these are not abstract. The issue of poverty and oppression and colonization is not abstract. This is not about just a theory, and that's what Paulo understood, that our theories had to come to life. And the way that he did it was through the way he was as a person. So little glimpses of who Paulo was, I felt as I was listening here, I got a sense, and I remembered him. He had these beautiful, sparkling eyes that, when he talked to you, it didn't matter who you were. It didn't matter if you were serving the food or cleaning the floor or who you were. He had this incredible capacity to speak to you as a full human being, a sense of compassion, respect, and dignity for who you were. And it didn't have to do with what you had read or what you had written, but it was the fact that you were a human being that shared the world with him. And so I believe that so much of our work has to be about how we come to the table. How do we come to the table? What is our coherence? I ask this in terms of men. Right now, this whole issue around, the hashtag Me Too, right? And I'm glad that women are speaking up in relationship to the many abuses that they've had to engage. But we cannot stop there, because we have to deal with the fact that we're adult women, and that where have we been complicit? Where have we betrayed our sisters? Where have we engaged in ways that have been incoherent with liberation? I only say that, Paulo, that none of our work means anything unless you're able to take it and engage with it politically in material ways. We must find ways to transform the conditions we're in, the context we're in. And it begins wherever we find ourselves. And I think that Paulo understood that. There was a way that he understood that fundamentally politics begins with each of us, and it moves communally, so that social consciousness is something that we cannot do just in our head by ourselves, but we have to do it together, in community, collectively. In writing the student guide, I have to tell you that what was amazing for me is, after reading Pedagogy of the Oppressed for 35 years, I still learned. I learned that the chapter 1 was really where Paulo set up his message about why we needed a pedagogy of the oppressed. In chapter 2, he talked about what was a pedagogy of the oppressed. In chapter 3, he actually sets out a methodology of the oppressed. And in chapter 4, he talks about what it means to be revolutionary leaders. So for people who say that Paulo Freire's work is passé, I want to essentially say, go back and read the book. Really sit down and read the book. Thank you.
I just hope that you've enjoyed this. I wish you could go on for 2 or 3 more hours, but we're under the gun of AERA. But I will tell you this, that the panelists have generously come and shared their stories with us, and I'm thrilled about it. Bloomsbury has books back there. If you want them, you can ask the panelists to sign them if you like. I don't know if some of them are willing to do that. I know Antonia said she would. Miguel, you want to talk about the breakout session?
Well, first and foremost, we want to thank many folks. First, to Antonia Darder for encouraging us to propose this session. This is very important because often when we're in these kinds of roles, it's easy to just sort of take credit. And it's all collective, but it's important. The idea came from Antonia. And Deborah Ball for believing in our vision and providing support to help bring this session to fruition. Thank you to Robert Smith for working through the many logistical details that were so very important for pulling off this event. Thank you to Bloomsbury Publishers for providing gifts for attendees and for sponsoring the wine reception, which follows this session. Thank you to Paulo Freire SIG Graduate Student Council members and UMass Boston doctoral students for helping with the dialogue circles that are to come. And last but not least, a very heartfelt thank you to all of our panelists and featured scholars who have traveled from near and far to participate. Nita Freire, Antonia Darder, Henry Giroux, Peter McLaren, AERA Shor, sorry, I just need glasses here. Chris, and I do, it's crazy. Chris Emden, Marisa Berlino, Ini Accioli, Nicholas Stahilin, Lilia Chavez, Marisol Ruiz, Marcel Haddix, and Curtis Acosta. We are honored and humbled to celebrate you. Thank you.